Great. So as we're going to get going, I'm just going to get our deck here. And I'll introduce Nicole Kelly-Westman, who's 221A's Education and Learning Programmer. And she's going to open our session today with a territorial acknowledgement.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. So I'm Nicole Kelly-Westman, and we have a bit of a different territorial acknowledgement today, obviously. So I'll just get started. This is a time that we need to mourn with our Indigenous relatives. It is with great grief that we recognize that the land itself is holding within it the loss of Secwepemc children. Oral stories about the magnitude of this loss have been told for generations by survivors of the residential school system. And only now was it proven through Western science with ground radar investigations. For those of you calling in from outside of Canada, we've included a list of articles to contextualize this devastating news. These lost children were not able to grow up and tend to their communities, care for their kin, or bring love and delight to those surrounding them. Rather, their absence has left a void of endlessly echoing and ricocheting grief. The truth of this nation's history is one of genocide. It is one of greed. All guests of this unceded and unsurrendered land need to sit with the discomfort of this tragedy and think critically about what to do to show up for our Indigenous hosts. The work of reconciliation should not be left to Indigenous folks to sort through on their own. I tend to write my land acknowledgements as specific celebrations of place, to remind myself and audience attendees of the significance in the uniquenesses of varying ecosystems. But I can't think of ways to celebrate the land when I can only think about how long she has been grieving, how long she has been waiting for restitution and justice. Please, should you have the financial means, I would ask you to redirect surplus resources you might have to provide support to Indigenous folks through this harrowing trauma. In this slide is a list of resources for you to support the Secwepemc Nation and other Indigenous groups protecting their territories from ongoing colonization and the displacement enacted by the governments of Canada and British Columbia. We've also included additional resources for you to learn further about the industrial exploitation of old growth forests, most specifically the Fairy Creek watershed, which is currently being protected by frontline activists and many brave Indigenous youth and land defenders. We'll paste links into the chat window as well. And as you can see in the slide provided, Jesse's also included a really incredible artwork by Wes Harmon, which brings some critical perspective to land acknowledgements. And this work is installed at the Vancouver Art Gallery. And out front of it, we can see a memorial with 215 tiny shoes to recognize the loss of those children. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for your territorial acknowledgement and sharing where we're at in Canada this week with a heavy heart and a wounded psyche. My name is Jesse McKee, and I'm the head of strategy at 221A. I lead the organization's research, programming, communications, and advancement. We're gathered today for a program that's part of the launch of 221A's digital strategy titled Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks. We've just completed our research phase of the initiative and we've published a research report of our findings, values, and recommendations. We convened a research cluster to investigate the potential of blockchain as an institutional technology. And through this collective work, we published a freely available 200-page PDF. It includes papers that survey our culture's ability to enable a mass collaborative financial turn, developed with new models for digital cooperativism. The emergent strategy is one that enables the conditions for recommoning land, data, and objects through the development of responsive and resilient asset sharing, power distributing, and value generating networks. We're supported by the Canada Council for the Arts Digital Strategy Fund, which awarded a multi-year grant to 221A in the organizational transformation stream of its awards. This funding program, which awarded grants from 2018 to 2021, supported strategic initiatives that will help artists, groups, and organizations better understand the digital world, engage with it, and respond to the culture and social changes it's producing. Today, I'm joined by the Roundtable's co-organizers and co-hosts. First, there's our Digital Strategy Initiative's editorial director, Rosemary Heather, as well as Daniel Keller, co-founder and co-host of New Models. This pro-complexity media aggregator, podcast streams, and Discord community began in late 2018, and I've been a member pretty much since then. Daniel was a researcher on our strategy and led an early workshop with us in blockchain at UBC called Imagining Collapse, which gave our project an urgent planetary acknowledgement of scale and scope. Rosemary's been working with 2218 since 2019 in developing this overall project. She authored a research paper titled The Staking Internet, included in our report, and she's going to continue working with us at 2218 to plan a nonprofit crypto finance working group, which will begin to model a staking pool between some cultural nonprofits in Canada. The topic of our conversation is social tokens and distributed autonomous organizations. It's exactly why I thought 2218 should research and develop blockchain tech. From our operating model, you can see how moving towards these new models in the blockchain and being developed by crypto communities will enable hopefully a more cohesive and collectivized form of an institution or some kind of practice in common. How we socialize, trade, and value information and culture in the digital space is what we need to better plan so that we can provide for our communities with sustenance, opportunities, and a viable digital economy that could be more equitable than the one we have now.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks to everybody at 2218 for organizing this, and thanks to everybody for joining. And as Jesse mentioned, the focus of the Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks project is what relevance does blockchain have to arts organizations? And with this group, we have the type of arts organization that's probably best suited to blockchain, which is just a self-organized arts organization. And maybe you don't even think of yourself in that way because you know, blockchain really leads to a different type of online collaboration to anything that might be considered like a art institution. So we're really interested to know what you found out. And yeah, the thing about blockchain, it is hard to understand. Like, I think I've only recently sort of really understood what decentralization means. It sort of happened in a conversation I had with Jesse and Tao, so that was helpful. But to really understand blockchain as something that allows collaboration at scale, and Bitcoin is really a really good. It's like the first use case and a really good model for understanding that, in the sense that you have this mass collaboration globally, and everybody's working in their own interest, but together they produce this value. Another way to think of it is, it's like Bitcoin is like user-generated content, but it's the users and not the platform that captures all the value, and that's super interesting. Like, that's really important. But the bigger question is, what else can you do with a blockchain? Is it only good for this use of creating value, which it's doing in ever more complex ways, of course, but yeah, or is it just a case that the value helps underpin other types of activity on the internet, but in an important way, like in terms of incentives and also penalization for bad behavior, being one important functionality that blockchain brings to coordinating of groups online. So again, really interested to hear what you found out. Thanks for joining, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Daniel now.
Hi, yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks especially to Jesse for doing all of the hard work at organizing and facilitating everything. You're really, really good at facilitating things. I'm always really impressed. And yeah, when you said that there was this opportunity to get a lot of these people together in one place to have this roundtable, I was really excited. Yeah, I just haven't actually really had the opportunity to be part of the conversation about this topic, even though I've been adjacent to it so much. I think that like right now is a really interesting time for all of us to come together to talk about DAOs and social tokens. And I guess first off, I mean, I know that those are broad terms. I think there's a lot of use cases for DAOs, considering the context of 221A and generally what we're all interested in. I want to focus more on the cultural applications rather than DeFi governance, although of course there's a lot of overlap there and we can explore that. But yeah, I just want to say thank you for everyone for being here. And yeah, I just think that right now is a very specifically interesting time because we're sort of at the very least in a pause in the bull market. And I think this is a good time to reflect on what is real and what is hype, what can actually be sustained, what's kind of been developed recently that is exciting and genuinely going to be useful. Yeah, and also just like that it's still a hopeful time. And I think that there's, I still think there's a lot of potential for this type of technology to yield really, really interesting results in the near term, not just in a sci-fi future. My experience with new models has given me some insight into managing online communities and the pitfalls and stuff there. And we are discussing some types of DAO-like migration. And so, yeah, I am also really just want to pick your brains and get some insight into how to do this kind of stuff. So with that, I guess can we just go around and have everybody introduce themselves and their projects?
Thanks, everyone. Thanks a lot, Jesse, and everyone at 221A for organizing this, and Daniel for putting me in touch with you guys and organize this as well. I'm Louis. I'm currently working with the Super Rare team. Super Rare is a crypto art platform that connects artists creating, tokenizing their art and collectors. So this platform is built on the Ethereum blockchain, which implies a number of interesting characteristics. And I do community things there. I love to think about online communities, and I came in the space through DAO projects. So been working in the crypto space for around three years now. Started working in the space through Aragon, which is a DAO project, which enabled people to handle funds on the blockchain through voting mechanisms. And I'm deeply passionate about this space and getting people together to collaborate together online in general, and how we can achieve that. And I've been writing a bit about that as well at albiverse.blog. That's it.
Hi, my name is Neil, and I'm an artist or filmmaker or something. And I guess I'm interested in blockchain since a while, but it was at the beginning on a personal level, and I made some jokes. And out of those jokes, like I run, like my studio became a production company slowly in the past years. And since the pandemic happened, the production company took over with technicians, developers, and we produce films and cultural stuff discreetly. And we make we've made this year a lot of small attempts at structuring and destructuring and playing with models of cultural production and diffusion. And I guess, and we are doing stuff now about that.
I'm Greg McMullen. I'm a lawyer. I've been working with Alberto on various blockchain things, starting with Ascribe back in 2015. And we've kind of kept up with projects since then. So with SayDAO, it's a DAO for loosely organized organizations funded by Human Data Commons. The goal is to incentivize kind of ongoing quality participation by awarding people who are active participants more influence, or what we call say, in the decisions made by the group. There's just a couple of things about how it works that I would want to note before passing it off to Alberto. The tokens are awarded for participating in things that the group itself decides is worthwhile. It's done on an inflationary model, so we give more tokens for each subsequent event than the one previous, which allows newcomers to not have much influence at the beginning, but quickly catch up to people who've been there for a while, as long as they keep taking part. And say can't be traded because your contributions to a community are only really meaningful to that community. And we don't want people to be able to just buy in and suddenly have a lot of control. And finally, to do this really successfully, to make sure that people are using it to build community, we want the tech to be as invisible as possible. So making it about the community rather than a blockchain project. So ideally, people wouldn't even know that what they're doing is on a blockchain. And Alberto has done some really amazing magic to make that possible. So Alberto.
Hey everyone, my name is Alberto and I'm a software engineer from Berlin. And as Greg said, we built SayDAO to incentivize participation. And as I guess you know, like onboarding people to a blockchain product can be daunting and intimidating for the end users. For example, some projects require to use MetaMask or like other wallet-enabled browsers. So for us, the main technical challenge was basically to build this fully decentralized app without any central server and without expecting users to have wallet or funds in their wallet to be able to use the app. So we spent quite some time working on usability and hiding all the blockchain parts as much as possible. And for this reason, we decided to use an approach called burner wallet. So basically you don't need a, I don't know, MetaMask or a wallet on your browser to use the product. You just need to open the page and the wallet is generated on the fly for you. And also we are using gas station open gas network. So this basically allows people to do transaction on Ethereum without having funds. So those are the two key things we put in the product. Thank you.
My name is Billy. I'm also based in Berlin. I worked as an artist for many years, and after an artwork involved cryptocurrency began in 2017, I sort of became more interested in the technology and started building an Ethereum in a bunch of different specialty areas, early NFT works, DAO works, some DeFi stuff, automatic market makers. In parallel, I got involved with a project called Cosmos, which is building sort of a new proof of stake application specific paradigm for blockchains, that all applications should be energy efficient and scalable. And you do that by having one application per blockchain. Since 2019, I've been focused on the Cosmos ecosystem. I'm now on the board of management at the Interchain Foundation, which is the foundation behind that project. Sorry. And since early this year, I got involved with a project called Folia, which was sort of a marriage of my previous art networks and my current skill set, which is a very sort of small scale, highly curated and really managed NFT kind of gallery where we build out custom blockchain solutions, and we try to make sure that the artworks are really engaged with the medium in meaningful ways.
I'm Penny. I'm working as like a cultural theorist, mostly out of Berlin, but also within the Goethe Institute and Further Field Gallery and Serpentine Research and Development Lab for DAOs across Europe. And I kind of sit in Black Swan from like a very early position, and there's been a lot of voices that have been active in the thinking and traversing around Black Swan. Black Swan, in a sense, first of all, was a paper prototype of a way in which we could decentralize and criticize and create an autonomous organization where the users, who are artists in this case, are in charge of their assets and resources, which they acquire from silent stakeholders. The reason why we required it from silent stakeholders was very much a political act. We're coming from a Berlin context, but I guess this is fairly global, in the fact that a lot of artists work to a certain degree and level, and then often they are creamed off the top from a lot of unpaid labor, which is potentially coming from project spaces, unpaid curators, unpaid interns, etc. And then they're taken from the top after they've acquired a certain body of work from commercial galleries, museums, etc. In Berlin, we often term this grooming. And from that position, we thought that it would be fairly important to move away from that archaic traditional model and instead hold these institutions and individuals accountable for basically paying into the system and providing resources and value from this very low level, which actually allows the kind of birthright of most artists. So we wanted to allow these people to support the local art scene. This is also coming from Berlin, which in a way over the last decade has had a huge amount of art spaces, studio rent increases, and basically kind of exasperating and accelerated gentrification. And so really it was about trying to find a kind of unique model that could actually become, in a sense, a practice of paying back into, and also, of course, on the other side, ensuring that Berlin's art world and scene is still dynamic, radical, and full of potential. Callum, do you want to talk about the next part of Black Swan?
Yes. Thanks, Penny. So I'm going to frame a bit more the relationship between Black Swan and trust. So trust is many things. We describe it as a collective project for the research, development, and maintenance of shared infrastructures and imaginaries. We have a space in Berlin and Schöneberg, grew into a Discord over the pandemic, which now has 300 members who research 6 core topics ranging from play and active forms through world building. In general, people come to trust for the ability to explore and discuss knowledge in the broadest sense and emerging fields of knowledge. And trust as a collective project builds infrastructure to support the interdisciplinary and collaborative creative practices that have emerged around it. And one of these infrastructures is Black Swan, or at least my role is kind of bridging the trust context and the Black Swan context. But we, over the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021, did research specifically in the trust Discord around governance models and ways of making collective decisions for digital communities and digital creative communities. And over the course of this, we called it a role-playing activity where we kind of encouraged people to push the frameworks to the fullest and to explore the possibilities and the attack vectors of different decision-making processes. But we looked at quadratic voting, a simple one person, one vote system, and a lottery. And in discussion with these working group participants, reflected back on the different affordances of these decision-making mechanisms and build them into our designs for our first digital tool, which Laura will talk a bit about.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura. I'm a researcher. I'm based in Berlin as well. And yeah, with Callum and Penny, I've been working on Black Swan. And after the working groups, the last working group that we held at Trust that Callum just talked about, we developed a prototype for a quadratic voting interface called Signet, which is the result of this first, like tackling the question or the problem of how can we decide together and how to create an experience and a useful tool that enable people to, first of all, have be more of a expansive experience of what does it mean to participate in such a decision-making process at a community level, but also we really wanted to take seriously the role of the interface also as a site where knowledge is created. And so part of what was really important for us while developing Signet was to make explicit the mechanisms underpinning the voting process. And following on this first prototype, now we are currently looking to tackle some of the other questions to realize the initial vision of Black Swan. And so beginning to try out and experiment with different economic models on the basis of like same methodologies. So really through working groups and workshops and like role-playing exercises.
Artemi, do you want to say hi?
One sec. Yes, I can. I have.
Congratulations on your baby.
Thank you.
Oh, I see. There he is.
Hey everyone, just a brief introduction maybe. Name is Artemi. I'm a final year PhD candidate at blockchain at UBC, and I'm focusing on I'd say the usable security and the human aspect of blockchain tech. So yeah, and I see some familiar faces. So hopefully I will be able to participate in the discussion as well as I can, considering the circumstances. So yeah.
I'm Sarah Friend. I'm an artist and software developer. I'm also based in Berlin and also part of the Trust community. But yeah, I'm here mostly today to talk to you in my capacity working with Circles UBI, a project that I've been the lead smart contract developer for since 2018. Circles is an alternative currency that has mechanisms that try to lead to more equal distributions of wealth over time. And there's a lot that goes into how that works, but I'm not going to explain it in the intro. I will explain it if you ask, and I did bring some slides with diagrams to help if it comes up. Circles has been in development for a long time. The project was first founded in 2015. There have been a few different incarnations of the Circles team. I've been on 3 of them. And we launched publicly in October of last year. The launch was really successful. Also, as an insider who had to keep everything running, quite painful. We had 60,000 signups in the first weekend. When I last checked the numbers, which was a couple months ago, actually, I haven't looked at them since February, but it was over 180,000 then. So Circles continues. The development team has been restructuring. I'm no longer operating as the smart contract developer to the project. As you might imagine, when you launch a blockchain application, the smart contract developer becomes the least important person on the team after a while, because you don't update that part. And I'm now acting more as an advisor to the project.
So I already introduced myself a little bit, but yeah, so I'm Daniel Keller. Probably all know that already by now. So yeah, I have some experience with new models. I'm also working, I'll say it's in the nascent phases, a project called Channel, which will be basically a NFT, or we like to say subscription token gated podcast network, starting with just a RSS feed with a bundle of content with new models, interdependence, Joshua Citarella, and we'll probably grow from there. So I'm kind of in the active stages of transitioning existing projects into more of a DAO framework and also working on other stuff in the space, but I have no technical experience whatsoever. I was an artist for many years. Now I speak on podcasts, basically. And I have a little bit of experience with DAOs, enough to, I think, ask hopefully productive questions, but not enough to answer them. I think that we are really at an important crux when it comes to all this stuff. Clearly, COVID, the economic conditions subsequent to that, various other trends, they've all accelerated the development of this stuff by many years. And now there's sort of the economic framework to facilitate some of the development, or to hype it anyways. So I, having some experience also in Friends with Benefits, and for everyone who is not familiar with that, that's one of the first tokenized communities, which basically just means it's a private Discord, which you need 60 FWB, which is an ERC20 token, to get access to it. It's using basically pre-existing tools, which was a huge vulnerability. It used Roll to issue its token immediately, which ended up being disastrous, to say the least. And I think we should really talk about that, because I think this is really one of the more interesting things that happened. Well, yeah, one of the more exciting things that happened with DAOs and social tokens. Yes, and also very dependent on Discord and other tools and Collabland bot. And there is this idea of well, I guess what is there, not iterative decentralization, incremental decentralization, which, okay, I guess is what is essential to do in these cases. But I think it was notable that Black Swan, that you guys talk about it as being role playing. Very much a lot of this stuff is still in LARP phases. The governance with Friends with Benefits is another thing that I'll mention, not to beat up on Friends with Benefits too much, but I saw a recent statistic that 3% of the users are voting on the governance things. And this is ostensibly a group of people who are very interested in these things. So I don't know the specifics about if it was bigger wallets that voted on it, or what's the distribution of votes. I think it would be really interesting to look at that data more granularly when it's available. But that seems like a huge barrier. And then the other major barrier, I think, with Friends with Benefits that clearly I think turns off a lot of people is the pyramid scheme nature of basically early adopters profiting at the expense of later adopters. So when you talk about having an inflationary currency with SayDAO, I think that's really interesting. We should talk more about that. Clearly, inflation isn't necessarily theft, as libertarians talk about it, but it is also redistributive and essential, probably. So I think that's really important. I also think the idea of silent stakeholding is also interesting, and we should maybe talk about that too. So I think these are a few issues that we already mentioned. There's also the legal framework. A lot of the more interesting things that are happening in this space, there's not really the legal stack to back it up, which also kind of shows you this LARP stage that we're in. So I'm wondering if everybody has any perspectives on things like the Wyoming DAO law and other developments, if we are moving towards a place where there is actually a legal framework to make this stuff worthwhile. And then another thing that was brought up, of course, again, I'm going to keep on running Friends with Benefits, but if there was not talented engineers on the team, there'd be no way that they would have recovered from the roll hack. So the idea that these tools are, any community can spin up their own DAO or their own social token and plug and play, it's clearly a myth. And if you don't have those people on staff, it's a huge liability to be using blockchain in general. So I think another question is, what positive things can we get out of DAOs or these types of collaborative frameworks without necessarily falling into these pitfalls of, inequality, technical risk. I guess I would also say maybe some cultural stigma.
I think like the bull market has kind of made the most, and in my eyes, of like the things that had been kind of built over the past 3 years or so, and I mean, personally, like the excitement has gone down on some of these things, and I just want to go back to, doing more like edge use cases, find new things and upcoming projects that I think are exciting on mine. I'm really into how people cooperate within DAOs and beyond governance. Once funds are allocated, how do you like manage operations inside the DAO? How do you map the different members and gradually equip these organizations so that they can really operate on more and more, on a higher and higher efficiency and on more and more use cases. Crypto is like, value on the internet. So DAOs often start with like pooling resources in the treasury, and these have been like the most widely used tools so far. I mean, there are memes going around saying DAOs are just an OSIS multisig from most of them, and it's pretty true. And DAOs are also like a lot of Discord stuff, and basically DAOs are a lot of performing this kind of like collective ownership today. And after that, I think will come like new ways of, because we're still like stuck with 1P 1V, multisigs, high gas fees and stuff. But I think there's a new wave of thinking around how to make that, be beyond these ideals of decentralization, fully, collective ownership, democratic voting and stuff. Like now that there's many people wanting to do DAOs and experimenting, we're starting to understand like, okay, maybe we'll have to make compromises here and there, have subcommittees, sub-treasuries, give up some of the, so-called decentralization to centralize some of the powers, some of the decision with the right governance mechanism. So I'm quite optimistic about these new projects that are allowing people, communities to adopt more granular structures. So not only a single multi-sig treasury, but more like a subset of committees with different roles and permissions, and different types, different ways of doing governance, and that are not like just everyone voting on every decision or one person deciding for everything. And so there are new voting mechanisms as well. I mean, they're definitely not new. They've been around for some time, but some committees like One Hive has been starting to experiment with conviction voting in the past month. And this is an interesting innovation as well. Just to finish here, and then I'm sure like everyone will have great takes, and we can dive deeper in any of these things. I'm quite interested into like how reputation can flow within these communities and how this impacts decision making. There are projects like Coordinate, a project built by the Yearn community that's basically allocating resources in a DAO through this gifting mechanism where everybody has a number of gift credits and shares that and spreads that to members around them in the organization. And that's the way resources are allocated. So this kind of like bottom-up emergent kind of ways to allocate resources, I think are very interesting, instead of like step-down voting, 1P 1V methodology. So yeah, lots of interesting things behind the scenes, which I think are going to come up in the next like couple month and probably like 12 to 24 months, I guess. Always takes time.
Was that One Hive that you said?
Yeah.
Coordinate. Is that what it's called? The project?
Yeah, Coordinate.
Okay. Greg and Alberto, first I'll ask you the question about what you're excited about. But I do want to talk specifically about the inflationary element. I think that's really interesting. And then also a little bit more about the voting mechanisms that you've settled on. But yeah, first off, what other projects are you looking at right now?
Sure. One thing that you mentioned was how the lack of a proper legal framework has left all of it kind of in a LARP zone. And I think it's exciting that some jurisdictions are starting to think about it. I don't think the Wyoming law does very much except kind of reskin existing corporate law to allow DAO pieces to come in, but it doesn't really recognize the new things that DAOs can do, and the kind of elements of corporate law that are designed for a technological environment that aren't really necessary under DAOs. So one project that I've been kind of involved in over the past year has been working with a group called Koala, a coalition of autonomous legal applications that has been working on what we call the DAO model law. That's a full sort of addition to corporate law that recognizes these, it looks at the goals of corporate law, like protecting investors, protecting shareholders, protecting the public, and providing a framework for an organization, and looks for what DAOs actually do and creates a legal framework that would give DAOs legal personality and limited liability as long as they comply with these kind of public protecting things. And it should be, a draft of that should be public for comment in the very near future. And we're hoping that that can kind of start a conversation about how DAOs can be recognized and more fully able to interact. Because right now there's like a really risky legal situation for anyone getting involved with DAOs, in that they might just be held responsible for anything that the DAO does. And DAOs can't technically enter contracts. So it's dangerous to interact with the DAO if the smart contract winds up doing something different than you thought it would, or if there's a security breach. So I think that's one really exciting thing that's going to unlock a whole world of new possibilities.
Cool, that's great.
Did you want to talk about the inflationary element now?
Or maybe
that later?
Alberto, do you want to say something also, or should we go to that? Yeah.
So I guess the question is, what is the most exciting use case for a DAO, right? So I want to share something that maybe is not that exciting, but for me, like 2 years ago, it was extremely exciting, and I had a lot of fun because I took part of LeapDAO, that is a DAO of developers that were working on scaling solutions for Ethereum. And at the time, I had two like wow moments. One that was related to the community, and the other one that was related to the technology itself. So about the community, I had the impression that the people that participated in the DAO felt like deeply involved and committed in the project. Because the project itself was, of course, technically stimulating for the developers there. And also because the payments were continuous, so there was no payday, let's say. So every time you had to like finish a task, you would receive the money. And there was also a token that was distributed based on the effort that people put in the project. On the other side, on the other dimension, that is the technical one, at one point we had to work on a spin-off project. And at that point, we created a new DAO. We moved some of the funds in there. We created a new ERC20 token for the project. And in a few minutes, we had our own company that was a spin-off of the previous one, and our own economy. And this can be obvious if you know what DAOs can do. But for me, that like years ago, I incorporated my own limited company in Italy. Like working in this way was like a totally paradigm shift. And it was extremely like empowering that I could create something new without going to the notary and pay 10,000 euros to some lawyer. And I was like ready to collaborate and work with other people and share value. And so yeah, that's my small like story around DAOs. Mm-hmm. And what I'm excited about is also what Greg said. I want to see something legal. I want to see a legal DAO, and something that is recognized by governments and can play at the same level of traditional companies.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, but maybe now we can talk a little bit more about the inflationary mechanism, because I do think this is just one of the, just fundamental flaws with a lot of this stuff. If you're trying to have any type of, leftist or social program implemented with this stuff, and not just fall into the path of least resistance, which is sort of anarcho-libertarianism when you're dealing with this tech. I think it kind of requires extra effort to not just go that route. So yeah, I'm wondering how you implement that. And also I'd like to talk more about quadratic voting, because I honestly don't understand it. And I would love it if you could just ELI 5 for everybody.
Okay, so we started kind of by cataloging existing DAOs and looking at the ways that they're doing voting. And most are doing the traditional shareholder voting or one person, one vote membership-based voting, with a few experiments in things like liquid democracy and quadratic voting. But we were thinking that in small communities, really what's valuable is participation. And you don't want to have one person kind of collecting all of the vote. You don't want a whole pack of newcomers coming in and it kind of becoming a popularity contest. Really what you want is to have the people who are actively involved having a really kind of dominant say in what's happening. Now, I don't think this would work on a societal level or for corporations where you have kind of people who are passively investing money and expecting a return. But for small group projects, I think this model really works well. And we kind of hit on this as a way to allow people to build up influence over time, but also to let newcomers come in and have a say. I can't even remember at this point how the idea came about, but it kind of was a revelation when it did. And Alberto kind of modeled out different kind of inflationary curves that would work for different groups and tested to see how it would happen in the long run. And we just found that this was, or could be, I guess, a pretty good model for letting groups function this way. I guess the tricky part is counting or deciding what counts as a contribution. And a lot of the reputation-based systems in the past have run into this thing where like showing up for a meeting or writing a paper for the group was recognized as something that should get points. But the person who brings snacks for the group every time they meet feels like that kind of caring contribution is devalued if they ask for a financial return for it. We are hoping that this, taking the financial element out by not letting the token be traded might kind of ease those concerns.
And the token then just has in ecosystem use only for voting specifically, basically.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on then, I guess. Billy, hello. I'm very curious to hear what you have to say now. I'm wondering also specifically if you can talk about how you think NFTs can fit into this, especially maybe beyond being just a sort of treasury that's backed the DAOs, but what kind of other use cases you're looking at. But first off, what other stuff are you looking at?
I've been really excited about the project mirror.xyz lately. They launched relatively recently, and it's meant to be sort of like a publication platform, kind of like Medium or something. Talking to the founder early on, though, he said that the vision is actually much more of like, I called it kind of like a dashboard for Web3, but I think the idea is that, it would be a place for access to blockchains to kind of become coherent and lower the barrier of entry in a lot of ways. So, the first feature would be publishing text to decentralized storage solution Arweave. Your username would be via an Ethereum name service subdomain. So, those are two features of decentralized internet, but like the user story also could just be very like Web2 feely. But then they started very quickly like adding features, moving really fast, adding sort of like mini products to the whole thing. One of the first one was like a fundraising capability. So anybody who has an account can just say like, hey, I want to do this thing. I'm trying to raise 5 Ether. If you submit to this, you'll get a token in exchange that represents a proportion of what you submitted. Sometimes there's like guarantees, like, if that happens and I sell this thing, I'll put all the money back in and your proportion will like pay back out as like an investment or dividends. There's also like not necessarily that requirement, it could just be like, I don't know, now you own some tokens which show that you were involved in something that I did. And I can use that in all sorts of interesting ways in the future. Maybe I'll give you rewards. Maybe I can use it as like access to something else. It's like a paper trail for the fact that you are involved in this thing. This is to say that all of this is like extremely gray zone legal. And the founder who is used to be a partner at, I don't have a partner necessarily, but at A16Z, the investment firm, they were in charge of the crypto part, him and his partner from a previous project. Talking to both of them independently, and sort of like brainstorming other project ideas, be like, is this a good idea? Is that a bad idea? Like, that seems like it could be extremely legally dubious or something like that. They were sort of like, our like general attitude right now is just like throw caution to the wind. If you don't do this, some 16-year-old will, who doesn't know or care about the risks. And like, every step of the way of me like working in blockchain, I've always sort of been like, this is a good idea, but I'm not going to do that idea because I don't know if it's illegal and I don't want to break a law.
Right.
And just to have like VCs or like also founders, now that Dennis is actually doing the project himself, he's like probably the one who's legally liable in all these scenarios. Just sort of be like, fuck it, like just move fast, break stuff. Like there's not enough regulation to like really hold yourself accountable and like see if it's popular before you like realize that like you've violated international law or something like that.
I mean, I think the legal thing is, well, that's exactly the issue and what I wanted to talk about more, because I mean, the bull case for most governance token is that you'll have the right to vote to get on-chain revenue delivered to that token, which I'm pretty sure makes it a security token. But if it isn't start as a security token, but it evolves into that, is that some kind of legal loophole? Does anybody know? Is that how that works? Or is that also just full gray zone?
It's pretty gray. You can go back and forth. Like the SEC said that Ethereum started as a security, but now it's not. So I'm guessing that they'll find that you can start as not a security and become one.
Okay.
And also looking at, say, Ken, the cryptocurrency that came out of the Kik messaging app, was tried and found guilty of performing sale of an illegal security, and it was like $5 million or something was the fine, and they raised hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. And so it's like, maybe it is worth breaking the law in this like Wild West space.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, I think that's an interesting line of questioning, but yeah. So Calum, Laura, Penny, Penny, I guess you went first before, so maybe you want to go again.
I'd love to. So I guess we're going to start with this question of what's exciting.
Yeah, why not?
I think like in general, what's been really exciting about this like move towards DAOs is also this kind of, I guess in a sense, like a cosmic shift between technology and the human. Like how instead of looking at technology from a very centralized perspective and then molding the human usage around it, instead the way in which a DAO can actually act and become in a way, a sentiment for building the technology and assets around culture as opposed to structure. And that kind of leads me on to what I find kind of exciting at the moment is about the potential of what DAOs have in relation to like asking questions like, who has the authority to make reality anyway? And like reality in a sense can be this like DAO as a world and what happens within it. And I think from like trying to move, I guess, because we've had a lot of examples now, maybe into a more art-based context.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I would probably say that I find really exciting Deluge's new DAO, which I think Folia has also been having a hand into at least kind of setting up or beginning the kind of stakes in that. And basically it's, from what I understand, a publishing DAO, which creates a funding pot that particularly works with queer, trans, and experimental writers that are particularly underrepresented in the publishing world. And I think this is also super important right now, because for those of you who are following publishing, there's been real problems with COVID, and actually that publishing on itself is very much in decline, and a lot of books have been pushed by 2 or 3 years, and that's really interesting in relation to relevance and the history of like what is left and what are the artifacts that are circling beyond the online world. So I think I would probably go for that one right now.
And I guess also I wanted to mention, because some of these mechanics have come up in the projects people are talking about, and I'm not sure if everyone or if anyone knows. Circles actually uses some of the mechanics we've talked about. So Circles is inflationary as well. So I'd love to hear maybe a little more detail from SayDAO about exactly how you're handling inflation. We inflate annually 7%. And then there's also payouts being minted to token holders per second. Also what Callum was describing with OneHive and their calls where you touch your nose, they're leveraging Bright ID as an identity layer. Circles actually also uses a web of trust identity layer, very, very similar in structure to Bright ID. And we do these corny calls where, you know, we make people verify themselves in like a online trust party too. It's descended from the older PGP primitive of a key signing party, just adapted to COVID era.
How did you settle on 7% a year?
We had some spreadsheets of how inflation would change, you know, what percentage of the inflation would be the monetary supply at different points. But to be honest, at the end of the day, we kind of just went with it. Yeah, like our team right. Talked a lot. We were like 5, 10, 7.
Split the difference.
Yeah, and there
is there a mechanism for changing it, or it's you
no.
just no? Okay.
Also, we were very, very scared of trying to govern a project like Circles, international project with currently over 180,000 signups. How are we going to decide democratically what the inflation rate should be? We thought it was better to actually just lock it in and let people fork if they want to.
Okay, no, that's interesting.
And you can do, in the models of inflation, you can do this sort of thing about how long before, you know, in a human's life, you know, do they end up with the same amount of money as someone who signed up, you know, 10 years before them? But it's been a long time since I looked at those, so I probably shouldn't go into detail.
So, well, now that we got an overview, I mean, actually, I kind of want to stick onto this inflation topic. Do you want to talk about how you're doing it with SayDAO?
So maybe I can quickly answer Sarah's question on how we calculate the inflation. So it's totally arbitrary. I mean, we made a model that is based on 2 factors. One factor is how much time, sorry, I start again. We allocate tokens every time an event happens and people participate to the event. So every time the event ends, we distribute token, we mint new tokens to the participants. And the amount of tokens we mint is a quadratic function based on the how much time passed from the last event to the current one, and also on how many people participated to the last event. So I don't want to go too much into details, but I'm happy to share the calculation basically in the smart contract with people that are interested. And just to give you a rough idea on how it works over time, I want to share with you also this simulation that we have done. So here we have some participants in the DAO: Alice, Bob, Carol, ABCDE, until Judy. And then here on the left, we have a series of events that the DAO is organizing. And for each event, we have also how much people participated and how much time passed between one event and the other. And based on that, we have a nice distribution of the tokens. And as you can see, Alice, Bob, and Carol, that are the first 3 members of the DAO, of course, at the beginning, they have the majority of the tokens. And the sum is always 100%, as you can imagine. But what is interesting is that over time, you have new people participating. For example, here towards the end, you have Judy and Ivan. And even if they joined the DAO late, basically, if they keep participating to events, they can get like a decent amount of tokens that they can use to vote. And as also Greg mentioned, people should not get like mad about the inflation, because tokens have no like monetary value. So we're not diluting the amount of money you have, and tokens are not transferable. So it's an ERC20 token, but that you cannot transfer. And just another thing, given that people mention how to have a, let's say, proof of person or proof of human, I recently found this other project called IDENA, and they have a blockchain that for proof of person. So it's another blockchain. I think it's not yet integrated with Ethereum, or there is no, as far as I know, there is no bridge between the IDENA blockchain network and Ethereum. But what they do is basically, a blockchain that mines humans. I don't know if this sounds good, but I kind of like it. And what you do is basically, when you participate, you have to create flips that are basically CAPTCHA. And then basically everyone in the network creates CAPTCHA that are distributed and must be solved by humans during the ceremony that happens every 2 weeks. And if you're good enough, like in passing all the ceremonies, then you're labeled as a human. And you need to keep your status, you need to keep producing CAPTCHA and solving CAPTCHAs.
That's interesting. Would that work for limit, like for instance, if you had multiple wallets, then that wouldn't necessarily solve for individual persons, just proof that you are a human at all, right? Or is there a so I don't know exactly all the details, but what I can tell is that it should be like difficult / impossible for a human to be able to have multiple wallets, because it would be too difficult to be able to participate to every ceremony and be successful. Okay. And how can you implement this protocol, or is it just it's too early to be integrated into something else?
When you say into something else, you mean?
I mean, into
like,
if you were going to make a social token project, or Friends with Benefits, for instance, could you integrate it with
okay, I have to tell you that I don't know. I know that you can have smart contracts in the IDENA network, but I have to be honest, I didn't investigate too much.
Okay,
so
yeah, I'm curious.
I don't know.
I'll look into it. I noticed you said, that you were trying to, make it as invisible as possible that you're interacting with the blockchain. Do you think that logging in with MetaMask is too much to ask for people? Because I wonder, because I kind of see it as being like a pretty user-friendly model going forward for logins in general. What would be more invisible than that? Like what do you?
I think that logging in with MetaMask is easy. What is difficult is what you have to do before. That is installing MetaMask, understanding what, I don't know, a seed phrase is, or your seed words are, and why they're important and why they're secrets. Understanding that it's an account that you cannot recover. And in my opinion, like, it's not that difficult to use MetaMask or install MetaMask, but it's just another mental model, and you need to put a lot of effort to like understand how it works. So me, I'm incentivized I guess you as well, and all the people here are incentivized to play with this because we understand that there is a lot of potential and a lot of value. But it's not maybe the same for other people. And it's not that they are, I mean, technically they can do it. Maybe it's just a matter of incentives and understanding a new model.
You know, MetaMask makes some assumptions about the user, for example, that they're on a desktop computer. And then also the invisible portion of getting crypto in the first place into MetaMask is actually also a pretty big hurdle that becomes invisible to you once you're onboarded. But yeah, I think Sadao said you're using a burner wallet. We made we made the same choice with Circles UBI. We've been criticized for it a lot, but I think can be a more user-friendly option.
What does that mean? Sorry.
It's a temporary disposable key created in the browser's local storage, so it lives only on the device.
Okay.
And
is a lot more insecure, and you can accidentally delete it really easily, and but the user doesn't even realize it's there, and the app just works for them.
And if I can add something, I also wouldn't mind a hybrid approach, like a custodial approach, as long as you can always eject, let's say, your identity or your key or your wallet from the service. So in my opinion, you can onboard people and have custody of their wallets. But if the person is like interested, or if they're managing, I don't know, funds and they want to take care and full ownership of their stuff, they can always like eject their identity and use a browser extension, for example. To me, that's reasonable.
What other, maybe anyone can jump in here, but what other things do you think that people who are working on these projects can do to help onboard people or make it appealing? Especially to people who, let's say, are aesthetically or ideologically kind of, let's say, find the whole space distasteful. How do you convince someone who's skeptical, a smart person who's skeptical, let's say?
So I encountered Bitcoin, I think probably in 2010, and then tried to use it for a project in like 2015, and it just was like an awful developer experience. And it wasn't until like 2017 that Ethereum was at a point that it was like, oh, like me, like definitely not a genius is able to do this thing. Like that was a big moment. But what made me like actually want to start like working in the industry was sort of this like recognition that the times that I'd encountered it in the previous, let's say, bull cycles, when it was headlines and you're sort of reminded like, oh yeah, cryptocurrency is a thing. I guess I should figure that out, or like I should try to understand that eventually. But like, honestly, it's too confusing or too many moving pieces. I guess it was the 2017 one was sort of this like, oh, this is like not gonna go away. Like the way that it's built is specifically so that it will only not go away. And so it's sort of like, I need to like actually make sure that I understand what this thing is, because it's only going to grow as more of a problem of me like not getting it. And like, even if I disagree or hate the people or the aesthetics, like I better get involved to make sure that it like, I don't know, not like I'm going to like steer it in the right direction, but like it's only going to get worse unless I like play an active role rather than like, continue to try to pretend like it's not going to keep growing or something like that. And that was like convincing for me to like, all right, engage, don't disengage.
Yeah, I mean, I think personally what I find so exciting about the space is how participatory it is compared to other tech. And because it's so small scale, you can actually have some influence within a project. It's not crazy to think that, whereas in Web 2 paradigm, that just doesn't exist. So for me, it's a no-brainer that if you're interested in participating in stuff, then it's much better, something that's just really intrinsic to crypto that you don't find anywhere else.
It's also participatory in terms of finance in interesting ways that, yeah, people could be excluded from traditional legacy finance, like you can't be unless you're a accredited investor. So that's something that people, once they understand that is a selling point, and something that I'm very positive on about the space. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I think one important thing is to decide whether you're joining a community or a DAO. Like if the point of it is to have a community that does stuff and the thing that enables that is the DAO, then the DAO part should be invisible to people who just want to do the community stuff. But if it is purely intended as like an investment vehicle or a way to allocate funds, then maybe the DAO rises in prominence. And there's a bit more importance in understanding those mechanisms.
Maybe I can also just add in like an example of it, which I think is maybe relevant here. Decentralized Detroit had a really interesting way of basically getting this information to the people that they wanted to be using their technologies by using stewardship. So they actually got on board like priests and kindergarten workers. I can't remember what the English word for that is. Small children, teachers, and people that are like members of the society. And so they actually taught them how to use the technologies and the onboarding systems. And then they actually created like community classes. And because there was already a trust of understanding these people to be like outside of the tech world, this actually onboarded a lot more people quicker. And they also had Saturday schools for youth to basically go to churches and community centers, and actually particularly people of color were targeted to create these kind of community coding education classes. So maybe it's also a little bit about this kind of osmosis of bringing on board other members of society like into the tech world, rather than always trying to think the other way around of us going in there.
I'm curious about that project. Do you know how that community outreach effort, which sounds comprehensive, was funded and supported? Because I think a big problem in crypto spaces is that people don't understand the type of social labor that is required to onboard new communities.
I mean, I think that it was co-opted by funding from the local Senate level, because it was also this kind of community outreach project. And I think also, particularly with Decentralized Detroit, it was also like very much sitting in this notion that people need to be in control of the resources there and to also understand what's going on, because it's an extremely difficult political position there of opacity, where resources are funded in the percentage of Black to white citizens that are active in that city. So I think this was also maybe affiliated with like a need as well at that very present moment in time. So one might also see that as part of the reason why it also worked, to bring these people on board as a form of like solution.
I don't know about that project, but I just did some research about mesh networking in Detroit, and that was funded by a Washington-based open society organization, the Mesh Network. So maybe it was something similar. Yeah.
Yeah, it all connects in also.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on that, these are just really early conversations we're having, but there's a few partners who couldn't join us today. But there's a group here in Vancouver called Ethos Lab. It's run by a really amazing woman named Antonia Ogundele. And she used to be a disaster financial planner for the major credit union here called Van City Credit Union. But she started like an online space for her daughter, basically, to learn and create a good space. And so they've grown, and they've described it now as like Hogwarts meets Wakanda for youth in terms of building out digital space and in the metaverse. But we're trying to think through this problem and what we do and how we get communities on board. And so we were also speaking with a group in Toronto, another artist-run center called Interaccess, which is a which is a great media art space since at least the early 80s there. But we thought, like, could there be a space for people to learn and for like people who teach and train on crypto also to learn from each other? So could it be some kind of supportive space like a vaccine hunters Discord or something like that? So you could have open questions there, but it could also be a space where educators teaching this stuff are learning how to do it better, are learning how to fail faster at their kind of teaching methodologies, as the space is so active and there's so many things coming up. So again, just like a decentralized kind of model to think about the education of this and how to grow usership and reach.
Caleb, you had your hand up. Do you have something to say? Or
yeah, I guess I mean it's kind of been addressed by everyone's comments, but I think tying into what Jesse was just saying, it can't just be in the form of education. Like I think we need different metaphors for grounding the development of blockchain technology. So much of the existing DAO tools have this idea of trustlessness, like an inability to trust the people you're working with built into them. They use metaphors of like raids or attack groups. And I think what we're interested in Black Swan and the way we think about these different role-playing exercises is how can we think about infrastructure that already exists within social groups, and then think about how digital tools could support that or like amplify things that are already happening, rather than trying to retrofit something designed for a very different purpose onto people. Like I kind of first encountered, or like my first speculative blockchain project was attempting to build renewable energy networks in Russia, which was like extremely absurd. But then it forked into trying to get German renewable energy cooperatives to use like a cryptocurrency and communication platforms to organize. And I had some meetings with the largest German energy cooperatives, and they just asked me, do you know how old the members of our cooperatives are? I said, no, not really. And they're like, they're 7 years old. They don't even have smartphones. You're not going to get them to use some weird technology. And I think like not everybody needs to use a blockchain or know they're using a blockchain.
yeah, I mean, there's 2 points of departure there of, well, what tools are missing in the stack? And also, do you need a blockchain for most of these use cases? I don't know which one you want to go towards, but I think they're both really important things. I mean, clearly you, with your experiments, you know, it was about governance, it was online, but there was no smart contracts involved at all, right? There's scripts. Is the latest iteration that you're working on the same, or is there some integration with multi-sigs and stuff?
Our design currently is fully off-chain. It's kind of like a tool for existing digital communities to signal preferences. And the way that we're planning Black Swan now is to design a module after a different role-playing activity. So in this initial one, we were looking at decision-making mechanisms. We're going to do one in September looking at modes of exchange. So really trying to put guilds against like artist studios as organizational models. So testing 4 different organizational models and how they exchange with the economy. And then later in the year, we also want to do one looking more at how groups construct value and how different ontologies of art construct different forms of value. And actually, if we were to build a digital tool around a form of value, like how could we actually do that in a way that makes sense? I don't know if Laura or Penny had anything to add there.
Just what Colin was saying made me think of, or what you maybe originally asked Dan about, like, do you need a blockchain, etc. Something that I spend a lot of time at Cosmos thinking about is like, where is or basically like dissolving the border between traditional technology stacks and cryptocurrencies. And, you know, why would you need a blockchain? short answer is because your application deals with money, but really, I guess it's a bit more about like trusted third parties. So it means it's dealing with something of value that you wouldn't want to trust a single person. So it might be the ability to decide something, but more likely than not, it's money. And so it's a software stack that has money as like a primitive. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a fully decentralized public blockchain that uses strong cryptography at every step of the way to have a software environment that uses money as a primitive. There's a lot of work that's happening with application-specific blockchains in which you could imagine the same sort of technical requirements as running a traditional web server. It's a single person who has root access to an Ubuntu server that's on DigitalOcean or something like that. Same as like running a Ruby on Rails app. You can use, your own. By default, you would want to use something like cryptography for verifying users, which means they have to like manage a private key. There are ways that you can reduce that load, but you could also remove that entirely if you decide that your like state machine doesn't need cryptography to like verify its users. You can use traditional web logins, you can use traditional anti-spam methods like email verification. Like all of that is technically possible. The design space for that, or like the ability to use that, is only really present in the last year or two through application-specific blockchain frameworks. But the point of those is that you're able to sort of design every layer of the stack instead of having like only the features that Ethereum or some other blockchain provides to you. But like after sort of like hitting my head against all of these things a million times, it's really started to dissolve the distinction between like software and blockchains. And I think that more projects should really embrace this idea that decentralization is like should be a function of the use of the application. And so for many of these DAOs, it really fits perfectly with the proof of stake model or the proof of authority model, where it's not about economically incentivize participants who are securing your blockchain, but maybe politically or community oriented. So for instance, Alberto's been working on this project with Left Gallery to sort of create a proof of stake version of that. And I think one of the ways that you guys have been talking about it is like you would actually have cultural institutes operate nodes. And so, the security of the network isn't about the fact that those institutes have, World War III server architectures or something like that. It's that that they're like culturally incentivized to be good operators of this network and to keep the node online and to make sure that people can access it. And just the idea that the network itself could reflect the participants in a much more tighter knit way. So you can have a DAO, which is itself an entire blockchain, and the members of the DAO, are the ones who operate the infrastructure because they want it to run. The line gets very blurry between a coordinated multi-sig and a blockchain at that point. But the real difference is that you're able to, still have software logic that uses money as a primitive in order to, facilitate coordination problems or, make sure no one person can run off with the money at any given point. And the barrier of entry will continue to decrease. The user experience will continue to improve. There's this real sort of like race of access, though. You know what I mean? Like the user base that exists today is essentially on Ethereum. And Ethereum just so happens to have one of the worst user experiences out there. And so if you want to build a product which is interesting because it has users, you better do it on Ethereum. But if you want to build a product which will limit your user base to a very specific subset of people on this planet who know how to install MetaMask, that's the price of having like users. The operational costs and the development costs are still quite high when you build things from scratch or when you try to do these other configurations. But I do think that is where sort of like you'll be able to start getting those two sites meeting in terms of access and usability.
Very interesting. What if there's like one tool you could identify that you think is missing from the DAO stack right now that would make it kind of like, let's say, reach a inflection point as far as more widespread uses? What would you say it is? What's like the one crux? That's for everybody, but Billy, I guess you probably have a good answer.
mean, it might be the faucet. The faucet is like, so all of tokens essentially are anti-spam mechanisms. If everybody's allowed to have gas token, then anybody can just like take up as much space as they want. And so like the faucet is supposed to be a way to like give out free tokens that don't allow somebody to take as many as they want and really run amok or something like that. So finding a better faucet solution, finding a way to maybe utilize other more traditional anti-spam techniques like email verification. You know, cool, you verify your email, you can execute as many transactions as you want on this blockchain. You know, you don't have to worry about what gas is, freak out about it. You can actually like interact with the token that you're interested in or the use that you're interested in without all of this like baggage that comes with blockchains. And every DAO that I've interacted with, tried to sign up for, just has such a huge onboarding overhead through something as simple as gas or the faucet.
Yeah, I want to answer the question with something that isn't a tool, which is that I think the biggest obstacle to DAO adoption is cognitive overload. And this isn't to say that DAO interfaces are usable, because they're not. I was recently part of a attempt to do some DAO explorations. Billy was part of it, and you know, we struggled to deploy, and we are fully onboarded people. But yeah, I think cognitive overload of understanding the implications of the different types of tokens I have, the different types of votes that are available when I'm configuring my DAO, this is actually not simple and not well explained. And if you do get over that, then you have a second ugly demon to rear its head, which is decision fatigue. Making decisions on many different aspects of what's going on is actually also exhausting and a big consumer of a very scarce, not well tokenized resource, attention. So, you know, I know there's so many discords turning into DAOs, but I'm part of like 25 discords, but I can't read all the messages, and I don't. I've them muted. So I think that mechanisms for addressing that problem are also very important. I know DAOstack has done some work on this with their holographic consensus mechanism, but I have not been part of a DAOstack DAO that really sees that in action in order to weigh in on whether it's effective.
Decision fatigue, I think, is really interesting, especially when it's trying to come up with like governance models from scratch. So I think it's sort of a matter of there being best practices developed, so there won't be necessarily quite so much customization that is expected from you.
You're trying to start a DAO. Which of the popular DAO frameworks are you going to use? You're going to have decision fatigue already before you've even gotten to having the DAO.
Right. There could be a bit of more of a wizard, I guess, type of experience for that. But yeah, you're right, for sure. And also, of course, it's just so hard to, I think, foresee how the government is a process. It's not an immutable thing. So I think it's very hard to know how to set up initial parameters with these things that don't lead to butterfly effect of
before you know it,
perverse
you're going to have to
incentives.
decide. You're going to have to decide how to decide. Then you're going to have a meeting about when your next meeting is. And anyway,
yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the problems are the same problems of any human coordination and organization. And I guess the goal here is to like make DAOs make those problems better and not just accentuate them or replicate them, which is often a problem. Anybody else have an answer to that, though, about tools or not tools?
I have some stuff. I think kind of similar to Sarah's point, what's missing is facilitators, like the bridges between the DAO and the like physical or tangible social group. I think there's like interesting discussion to be had around the role of institutions. And I guess if we're talking about like artistic communities, could this not be the role of the museum or the cultural institution to facilitate groups of artists working together and like managing the translation of a repository or a treasury and the people who are organizing around it. Like, I think there's interesting scope for if you shift the location of the gatekeeper, or you like distribute the responsibility of gatekeeping. I'm not saying like get rid of it altogether. Then maybe the gatekeepers could actually play more of a role facilitating these processes. And yeah, in terms of like a module for DAOs, I think also, you know, it's great if you want to collect NFTs or different cryptocurrencies, but it doesn't translate well into other forms of value, I think. Like, could you have a knowledge base or something that is collectively governed? That is the source of value for a community.
Okay, I was going to say, I have kind of 2 points. I think one, on the more theoretical end, is that a lot of DAO projects seem to want to reinvent the wheel on everything. And I think this is a common problem in blockchain land in general. But there's been a lot of work done on how groups coordinate, how groups work together, different organizational forms. And there's been a lot of learning in how to delegate decision-making authority to a board of directors, to a staff of an organization. And I think DAOs will eventually fall into something in that vein, maybe not exactly the same, but in a way that allows operational decisions not to be in the hands of people who just want to be in the community, but still gives them influence over those if the staff gets out of control. So I think there's a lot of learning that can be done there. And I think eventually those sort of tools will fall into place. The other thing is a more practical thing with DAOs on Ethereum, and in particular, I think ways to deal with transaction fees are really important right now. And it's both really difficult because of how high those transaction fees are and limits the amount of stuff that can be done. And just the notion of transaction fees is really impenetrable to new users. And I think that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, anecdotally, Circles has been forming new legal entities. I mean, it's been forming new legal entities since it started, and it keeps discarding them and making new ones. But recently it decided to be a co-op, like a traditional co-op with working groups and a board, not a DAO, for a variety of reasons. So yeah, the world of legacy organizations has things to offer crypto projects too.
Could you put a co-op on chain? I mean, is it different than a DAO in format actually, or?
That's a great question, but I would defer. I would defer it. I'm not sure. I actually wrote it down as one of my questions for the group myself. What is different from a one person, one vote DAO from a co-op, legally speaking?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not sure if anyone has an answer to that, but
I can
yeah. Oh yeah,
give
go
a
ahead.
Quick
Please.
answer. The big difference is the distribution of profits. So for membership-based associations, which is kind of what a one person, one vote DAO is, there's not really any entitlement to ownership of anything. It's you get to take part and the association owns itself and all of its assets. But if the association dissolves, there's not like an entitlement for the member to take their toys and go home. With a co-op, that's a little bit different because everyone actually is an owner and is entitled to profits and sometimes liabilities, but that's kind of distinct for different jurisdictions.
I mean, I also wonder, is there some middle ground between one vote, one person and token voting? Has that ever been implemented, like vote on a curve maybe, where there's still levels of influence, but it caps out at a certain point? If you have more than 1 million tokens, it caps out there or something like that. Billy, do you know if there's anything like that?
I mean, it makes me think of quadratic voting a little bit, where there's diminishing returns. So
yeah,
the difference a million and a billion is, or maybe that's not a good number example. Sorry, Greg.
I think quadratic voting is usually thought of as a way to allow people to weight their preferences, but it can also kind of cap inequality. So if you have a really steep curve, then if you have that billion votes as compared to my 10 votes, sure, you'll have more influence than me up to a point, but maybe your influence is only double mine rather than a billion times, because if the curve is steep enough, then your 20th vote will cost 500 million tokens, and you won't be able to kind of outweigh the entire vote just by virtue of having more money at stake.
How do you avoid like the attack surface though of people making multiple wallets in that situation and overcoming it that way, especially if there's a hard cap where you could just cut, you split your wallet in half? I mean, I guess that's just a problem there, but is there any specific method for addressing that?
Quadratic voting requires identity.
Okay.
Like other civil resistance.
Okay, that makes sense. Maybe we can just focus, I guess, also just like on art institutions or cultural institutions, but I'm just wondering like what will the first art institution that turns into a DAO look like? How could an institution turn into a DAO if they wanted to? I mean, an institution like 221A, for instance, but let's say more like an actual museum. Yeah, I don't know if there's any thoughts on that.
First step is that they need to own crypto. I don't know. I mean, looked at more institutes who are actually taking like a concrete investment strategy of like keeping some of their assets in crypto, but like managing USD with the DAO is just like not really gonna be possible.
That's not enough of a reason.
Yeah, probably not traditional art institution, but recently Museum of Crypto Art, which is a museum founded, I think it's native to crypto. I don't know where it was founded by Colborne, who's actively curating in the space. They recently launched their token, and so they have a whole plan and model around how they want to do that. I don't know. I don't have any specific detail, but I guess, yeah, in order to become like a DAO, I mean, you could definitely operate like a DAO, just through, adopting the right culture and practices and stuff, but I guess that's where tokens become, interesting in a way, is that they act as this way to enforce like this system of ownership and stuff. So yeah, I guess they'd have to spin up the Louvre will have to launch their own token or something.
Right. Do you know does anybody know of any art institutions that are talking about this at this point? Or any collections or anything other than NFT specific?
I think Left Gallery has been working with some institutions on this, but I don't remember the details.
No, just like a very quick word about like institutions adopting DAOs. I don't know if it's so if like in the past couple months, you guys have seen in your like surroundings, which are not like the blockchain space or the crypto space or the tech space, but I think like DAOs and communities and doing things collectively on the internet. I mean, yeah. So basically, like these trends are real in many different areas of society, and it coming back to the acronym that we use, like decentralized autonomous organization, which is very barbaric, very techie kind of jargon that nobody's going to understand. I think like DAOs are like existing in different ways in many parts of societies. Yesterday, still like, you could hear about these people like, collectively administrating, common goods and doing that through some governance systems and stuff without the blockchain and stuff. I think, on like taking a step back, these like DAO things are just like the appellation for the technological tools that are emerging, but in the rest of society. You can see like through social movements, artistic movements, even the teenagers are just like doing things in these ways through, you know, remixing social media stuff and whatnot. And so yeah, I don't think I think like now we're just so far from the real adoption in mainstream. So my question to you guys, not being like from the traditional art world, is like, is the concept of a DAO going to imply a shift also in how these art institutions think and work? Because I already see like these changes and these like social trends in society today. And these teenagers are going to use these tools without knowing that they're called a DAO very naturally, because maybe that's already developed by some, yeah, through some products today, or I mean, everything is already there. It's just about bridging the gap. So yeah, question is like, do traditional art institutions need to adopt DAOs, or is it going to create new institutions that are like adopting the values of the current, you know, social trends and these new collectives that we see today on the internet and what you guys are doing and stuff?
Yeah, maybe just to respond to Louis, thinking through, yeah, I hope it changes the structure of the institutions. Like that's the hope behind this technology, is that it changes, you know, the meat space to kind of go with it. But one of the groups we were learning from and partnered with us for some programming was in Berlin. There's the Bitcoin project that's run out of the Haus der Statistik. But what's interesting about that project is they're trying to find a way to build a DAO around an already decentralized form of operation within a community. So I think there's ways that you can find existing forms of DAOs already just behaving in the world, and then, you know, I think you can find ways to code them and bring them into this space to kind of better like recognize the value and to better distribute the value. So I think it could be an interesting way for institutions to take more seriously how they work with decentralized forms of culture, because I think the traditional art institution has always been focused on the author, and that's about singularity and the value of the artwork kind of being driven higher and higher through that. In Canada, no, we didn't have much talk back from the institutions about blockchain. This was earlier, before 2020, so we started some conversations in 2019 with some larger orgs here, and there wasn't much uptake there. But what was hopeful, and this is something that our Tao Fei, who's operating the call, and she's our program producer here, but she brought this article to our attention, which was kind of around the NFT boom earlier in the spring. But essentially, it was like an idea for the British Museum to work with NFTs to kind of, what was it called? To decommission works and to repatriate them. So works that have been stolen from processes of colonization over centuries. Like the museum no longer retains the object, but maybe they can retain a memory of the ghost of their colonization. And what does that mean? And then what kind of community forms around that ownership? And then what kind of community then can respond to that kind of repatriation of that artwork at the same time? So I don't know if the British Museum answered that article or really took part in the conversations that were happening around it, but it did create a bit of a comet's tail behind it as an interesting idea for legacy institutions to learn from.
So I wanted to offer like a practical answer to the question of like what I would say to a legacy institution that wanted to start a DAO, disregarding the fact that I may not be fully bullish on the prospect. But I would suggest that they LARP their DAO before they commit to a DAO, and also before they commit to software development. I feel like there's a tendency in organizations who get involved in blockchain to think that the first thing they should do is like hire a software developer. And that's actually expensive, and you've signed yourself up for a lengthy amount of maintenance. I think Black Swan is doing this, creating prototypes of how Black Swan should work that aren't interacting with the blockchain and don't have a system of smart contracts. You could even do this in a spreadsheet. And this would help that organization understand if the mechanisms they're introducing to their governance process are going to fit their goals without a significant financial investment or technical investment in a code base.
Maybe also I can just give 2 examples that are actually functioning DAOs, like within an art infrastructure. The first one would be Zine, which is based in London and run by Peter Halsgrove and Ben Vickers. It was originally ran like in a kind of top-down way. They work with editions that are commission-led. And then they decided last year to bring on this DAO structure in order to think about what could be potentially group curation of Zine. And so their DAO works as in they have a group of curators that basically work together in order to manifest the decisions and allocation of funds and which commissions go ahead and so forth. And they also use voting protocol for this. I think that this is one way that it works. I would be really wondering what the implications would be on a level that is outside of maybe a kind of selling platform for arts, like, because then in a way, what you're giving up as an institution to a DAO framework can potentially maybe lead to the deprofessionalization of certain positions within the art organization. I think that Harm has, from Left Gallery, has a lot of really interesting points on this, about how to actually keep professionalization. So really people whose work is led through years and years of research, and by no means is curation an easy thing to do. So also giving that up to a structure of voting would definitely not be something that I would be for on all levels. And also I think really interesting in this vein of giving up certain points of curation would be the new project that Furtherfield Gallery has launched in London called the People's Park Plinth, I think. And this is, yes, Sarah? And this is, maybe Sarah, you can talk about it a little bit more, but just to very quickly, as I understand it, is a modus where they've decentralized the park on digital artworks that can be voted on through the contracts that are maybe Sarah, could you explain?
I want to be cognizant. I've seen a couple people with their hands up, but it's a quadratic voting platform developed by an arts organization to take into account the different types of sort of stakeholders and what goes into the park. And there's a number of things that they do. One of them is like vote weighting. So depending on where and how you're voting and which organization you were channeled through, your vote is weighted differently in the final outcome. This is, I think, what Penny is talking about preserving expertise or considering different stakeholders with different, in a different way.
I would say that existing institutions should not become DAOs right now and probably can't become entirely DAOs. We don't know first on the technical side, on the voting methodology side, there's a lot of experimentation that should be done first. So I think institutions that are interested in DAOs should do that experimentation. And I think the prototyping idea is wonderful. Just the idea of locking yourself into the tools that we have now for the long term is probably not a great idea and doesn't really work within existing legal frameworks. So institutions would be kind of still relying on existing legal frameworks, but hollowing out their inside and plugging in DAOs. And I think that might be a good idea for some, but they would need to try it first. So I think a lot of this is reliant on these new legal structures emerging. And until that happens, an extended prototyping phase is probably the best bet for institutions.
One thing I would like to add is that the goal of SayDAO is to incentivize participation in some kind of communities. and the model can work for some organization, but maybe it doesn't work for others. And that's totally fine, because the, let's say, beauty of a DAO is that you can define your model, how you want to, what kind of participation, sorry, what kind of thing you want to incentivize, and you can more or less code it. Just to continue what Sarah said, I totally agree in like, don't hire a developer, don't hire 2, don't hire 3 developers until you have a clear idea on what you want to incentivize. And also to continue what Billy said before, well, what I think is that most of the DAOs we see now, they have a quantitative approach. So they try to quantify, I don't know, time spent on something, or tokens you have, you can use the tokens to vote. But there are like other models that are, I would say, I'm not sure if it's totally correct, but more qualitative. So in the left gallery example that Billy mentioned before, the idea was to have some nodes run by some institutions. And in this case, you have something that I would define more like a qualitative approach, where you select some of the participants. And it's not specifically on, I don't know, time or tokens. Let's put it like this.
I just wanted to go back to this question around museums becoming DAOs, or like what that would mean or what that would look like. And I think, jumping on what some other people were saying, like there's just an incompatibility between the current idea of a museum or a cultural institution and the idea of a DAO, or like the way that a DAO functions. And I think it comes down to also this idea of like jurisdiction and the nation state, and the way that cultural funding is often structured as coming from a government, and then kind of like playing into this idea of national patrimony and cultural heritage. And maybe the museum as DAO is more a federation of existing cultural institutions. I think there's something interesting in this panel we're in now, and the work that Furtherfield also has been doing in building networks of like cultural communities who are interested in these questions and interested in new ways of coordinating, distributing resources, and making decisions. And I mean, I don't know what 221A's plans are after this, but there seems to be interesting scope for some sort of role-playing activity between the people present here around what what a cultural institution would look like if we all came together in some way. Yeah, I guess this idea of like what comes after this panel, or like how do we, like someone was mentioning this before also, like every DAO tries to reinvent the wheel. Also within like cultural DAO projects, there's not much dialogue between activity. Like it's more work to try and share and communicate what you're doing than just do the project that maybe you get funding to do. And so it's like, how can we actually facilitate this, like a building of some sort of code base, or like theoretical code base, for the questions that we're asking.
Very good.
Yeah, thanks for the prompt, Callum. Yeah, we don't know what comes next, but we want to stay in touch, and we don't want this to just turn into like a Discord chat. So I think we can see what we can do together. But I think what's important to think and keep in kind of perspective is that, like, you know, we're running up against this kind of like either or option, like, oh, let's just turn the museum into a DAO. But I don't think it'll happen like that, because it's, you know, the culture and technology is such a garden of like forking processes that, you know, I think DAOs can start to assemble within museums and outside of museums, and it will start to kind of like influence what happens at that institution. Like, and also to say that institutions, older institutions, those very kind of like dusty ones, or now we could call them Lindy institutions, I guess, with kind of internet slang. But Lindy just means it's something very, very old, and it's probably going to stick around for a long time because people are used to it and they understand it, and it's functioning well enough for the majority right now. So with that in mind, you know, I'm just recalled like earlier in May, Dan, Rosemary, and I did a session with Artemis Summer Academy for Blockchain at UBC, where we kind of talked about DAOs and stuff. But they came up with, the group I was working with came up with a really interesting model for like an academic DAO that was coming from students to kind of like, well, we need to learn things, we need to introduce new things into the curriculum faster, and we need to learn better on how to introduce these ideas and what's working across different schools. And so they came up with like a structure for a DAO that could be a consortium of different institutions across the world, and then different levels of people within each institution that could decide how a curriculum could shift and change. And then the curriculum itself could then, or the consortium itself could then vote across the board how that should change for the discipline amongst those schools. So that was like a super interesting idea that, like, you know, the DAO becomes like maybe a fresh add-on to a very old institutional model, but all of a sudden can accelerate this change process like very quickly using traditional means. Of course, it would take a lot of planning to get all of the schools and everybody on board to kind of agree about what should be happening and then how those decision makings and processes. But that's the cultural work that kind of we're interested in. So I guess, yeah, we're interested in those messier kind of longer arc processes and seeing this as like an institutional technology. Yeah.
This is going to be maybe a superficial note to end on, but I was just wondering if anybody has a better idea for a term other than DAO, because I think everyone hates it. Same with NFTs and any of these acronyms, but let's say DAO in general. Is there, because I think also like we're going to eventually, not every DAO is going to have DAO in the title, right? So what's a better way of describing these things maybe?
I mean, Cosmos, we just call it governance. It's like every blockchain has token voting built in, and it's also like, it's awful. I mean, sorry, not that like the tech is bad. I mean, the tech is probably better than a lot of the ETH experience we've had, but just like, you don't realize what you're inviting into your life when you invite thousands or tens of thousands of strangers to make demands on you. You know what I mean? Like if you're worried about companies who are like bending to the will of the shareholders, like most of those shareholders don't have direct voting rights. And like you invite chaos, and the loudest and the worst voices are often the ones that are the most persistent and the ones that have the least to contribute, the ones who demand the most. It's like the worst customer configuration you can imagine. And so like actually really mostly encourage people not to do, especially large scale DAOs, because like you're going to only like worsen the whole process of making decisions. It's awful, especially when money's involved. And this entire industry of lobbyists is finally evolving. Like in Cosmos, you actually really need like a lobbyist to help you get an issue voted on, like to get people to show up, to get people to do a positive vote. And there's just like, it's ripe for the worst nepotism. And it's just like, you have people who have time to like make tweets and run marketing campaigns. You have people who don't, but like that is not often relevant to the value of the proposal.
But so there will be an emergence of like a politician class basically, or a lobbyist class, which is a little bit different. But yeah, I mean, I don't see that as necessarily a horrible thing. It's sort of inevitable that you're going to have delegates, but anyway, I think governance, that is a more neutral way of calling it. That's for sure. Louis?
Yeah, I think it's also like I felt like DAOs it's more like of a logic and a way of thinking and seeing like a collective way of organizing distributed ownership or whatever we call it. But I think some of the institutions that are emerging are going to remain this very like DAO. So Ethereum, Cosmos, these big like DeFi protocols are like these on-chain technologies that operate through token voting and some. I mean, and all of them have kind of like settings bear the mark of the time they kind of came up. Like Bitcoin is like this very like first DAO that came up and doesn't change and stuff. I mean, yeah, change it also dependent on culture. Bitcoin doesn't change because it's part of the culture, and Ethereum it changes slowly because there's another culture. And so when it comes to communities, I kind of felt that now we're talking about tokenized communities, we're talking about DAOs and stuff. I mean, let's see if token remains a thing and people start to use it to kind of denominate things, or if it's coins or whatever. But I feel like these communities are going to remain communities that leverage technology, like some other communities leverage social network, and eventually, like for most of like these DAOs and these different categories, for example, like startups that are going to potentially like issue their own, you know, token and have their own treasuries and hand off part of the governance to their users and stuff. I don't think these are going to be called DAOs, although they operate like DAOs, and same for these communities. I think they're just going to have a name like most of the things that we know today. Maybe some of these things like these big DeFi protocols and layer ones and stuff could be called DAOs, although they're not even called DAOs at first. So yeah, I'm quite optimistic that the word DAO would be more like a technical appellation or something that remains behind the scenes in the future. I think we could just have to name things by their name.
Yeah, I think it'll remain a useful umbrella term for a certain category of organizations. But I think as this work is done and people experiment and find new, like an infinite variety of kinds of organizations that it makes possible, and we'll see different names for the different functions come out that are probably more fun and more descriptive than DAO.
Jesse, we're over, right? Or
thanks, Dan. That was a great kind of hosting gig, epic session. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining and sharing and being so generous and curious with us. So if there's no last comments, enjoy the rest of your evenings and days, and we'll talk soon. Ciao.